Today I want to explore a topic that I find genuinely interesting and one that connects to a part of my personal journey that I have been thinking about for a long time. I want to talk about Confucianism and how someone wired the way I am, deeply values-driven, empathetic, but also intensely private and protective of personal boundaries, might find both comfort and conflict in this ancient philosophy. Before I get into the connection between INFJ traits and Confucianism, let me give a bit of background on what Confucianism actually is, because I think a lot of people have heard the name, but are not entirely sure what it means in practice. Confucianism is a system of thought and ethics that originated in China around 2,500 years ago. It is based on the teachings of a man named Confucius, who was a philosopher and teacher. He was deeply concerned with how people should treat each other, how society should be organized, and what it means to live a good and meaningful life. His ideas were not presented as a religion with a god to worship or a heaven to aim for. They were more like a guide for how to be a decent human being and how communities could function in a way that was fair, harmonious, and built on mutual respect. However, over the centuries, Confucianism developed rituals and practices that gave it a religious feeling in some cultures, particularly in parts of East Asia like China, Korea, Japan, and Vietnam. Whether you consider it a religion or a philosophy really depends on your perspective, and I personally think of it as a philosophy with some ceremonial elements rather than a formal religion. The core ideas of Confucianism revolve around a few central values: relationships and the responsibilities that come with them, respect, particularly for elders and those in authority, kindness and genuine concern for others, doing what is right even when it is difficult, honesty and trustworthiness, and the importance of continuous learning and self-improvement. These are not complicated ideas. They are actually quite simple at their core. The complexity comes in how they get applied, and that is where things get interesting for someone like me. Let me start with what actually resonates. The emphasis on continuous learning is one I connect with strongly, and it is actually part of why I started this channel. I believe that learning does not stop when formal education ends. In fact, some of the most valuable learning I have done in my life happened completely outside of a classroom. Reading on my own, having real conversations with people from completely different backgrounds, researching topics that genuinely interest me, making videos, and discovering what I think about something through the process of explaining it. All of that is education. And Confucius believed this too, that a person should never stop developing themselves, should always be asking questions and seeking to understand more. For someone who is naturally curious and introspective, that idea is deeply affirming. The value placed on kindness is another one that sits well with how I naturally approach the world. I genuinely care about people. I want interactions to be honest and meaningful. I do not like cruelty, whether it is directed at me or at others. And the Confucian idea that kindness should guide how you treat people, not just those you like or those who are like you, but people in general, that feels right to me. Honesty and trustworthiness are values I hold very seriously. I find it hard to respect people who are consistently dishonest, and I find it even harder to maintain closeness with them over time. The Confucian emphasis on being a person whose words and actions actually align, someone others can genuinely rely on, is something I try to practice even when it is uncomfortable. Sometimes honesty creates friction. Sometimes being straightforward about what you think or feel is not the easy path. But the alternative, performing a version of yourself that does not match what is actually going on inside, feels worse in the long run. The idea of doing what is right, even when the easier option is available, also connects to something I feel strongly about. There is a kind of internal compass that I rely on heavily. When something feels wrong, even if I cannot immediately articulate why, that feeling is usually pointing at something real. And when that feeling and the external pressure to just go along with something come into direct conflict, I almost always end up siding with internal compass, even when it costs me something socially. Now, let me talk about where Confucianism gets complicated, because I want to be honest about that too. The part that I struggle with most is the extreme emphasis on family loyalty and collective harmony. In Confucian thought, family is not just important, it is the foundation of everything. The relationships between family members are considered sacred, and maintaining those bonds is treated as a moral obligation. Respect for parents and elders is not presented as a suggestion. It is presented as a duty. I understand the value of family. I understand why that structure made sense in the societies where Confucianism developed and became influential. But I also know from my own experience that family is not always a safe space. That the people who are supposed to protect you can sometimes be the ones causing the most damage. And in situations like that, the insistence on preserving family harmony, no matter what, starts to feel less like wisdom and more like a pressure to stay silent about things that should not be accepted. There is a real tension here. The idea that you should maintain peace within a group, that you should prioritize the well-being of the collective over individual feelings, can be beautiful in the right circumstances. When the group is genuinely healthy, when the relationships are rooted in mutual respect and genuine care, that kind of harmony is something worth protecting. But when the harmony is performative, when it requires the most sensitive or most hurt people to keep quiet and keep smiling so that the surface stays undisturbed, that is not really harmony. That is just silence imposed on people who deserve better. The respect for elders principle is another one I want to address carefully. I do believe in treating people with basic dignity. I think rudeness and dismissiveness are not traits worth cultivating in anyone. But I do not believe that age alone entitles a person to unconditional respect. Respect, as I have come to understand it, is something that is built through how someone treats others. It is earned through consistency, honesty, fairness, and genuine care. A person can be elderly and still be unkind, manipulative, or harmful. And when that is the case, I find the expectation to simply defer because of their age to be genuinely difficult to accept. What I am more comfortable with is the idea of treating every person with a baseline of kindness, regardless of age, status, or background. That feels right to me. But unconditional deference based purely on hierarchy, that is where I have to draw a line. Now, let me bring this back to the INFJ experience, because I think the connection is actually quite layered. People wired this way tend to have a very strong internal value system. They care deeply about doing the right thing, about being genuine, about contributing something meaningful to the world around them. In that sense, several of the core ideas in Confucianism align naturally with how they already think and operate. The emphasis on integrity, on continuous growth, on treating others with consideration and honesty, these are things that feel like home rather than like rules being imposed from outside. But INFJs also have firm personal boundaries that are not negotiable once they have been pushed past a certain point. There is something often talked about in discussions of this personality type, which is the idea of cutting someone off completely after they have repeatedly crossed a line that should not have been crossed. It is not done dramatically or impulsively. It usually comes after a long period of patience, of giving chances, of hoping things will change. But when that point is finally reached, the disconnection is real, and it tends to be permanent. That pattern sits in direct tension with the Confucian ideal of maintaining group harmony and prioritizing relationships above individual feelings. If maintaining a relationship requires someone to continuously absorb behavior that is harmful to them, the INFJ response is eventually not to maintain it. And navigating that, particularly within communities or families where the expectation is that relationships should always be preserved, can be genuinely painful. There is also the question of how Confucian ideas interact with religious belief, which is something worth acknowledging. In many Asian cultures, Confucianism has been woven so deeply into the fabric of everyday life and social expectations that it does not always get identified separately from religious practice. The emphasis on family roles, on deference to authority, on maintaining social harmony, can show up inside religious communities and get presented as spiritual obligations rather than cultural norms. For someone trying to figure out what they actually believe versus what they were raised to accept without questioning, that blending of philosophy and religion can make things harder to sort through. I think the most honest approach, and the one I have personally arrived at after a lot of thinking, is to take the pieces of any philosophy or belief system that genuinely help you live in a way that feels true to who you are, and to be willing to examine the parts that do not, rather than accepting them simply because they are part of a tradition or because challenging them feels uncomfortable. That is not disrespect toward those traditions. That is the very kind of thoughtful engagement that Confucius himself seemed to value in the people he taught. Learning, questioning, refining your understanding over time, being honest about what you actually believe rather than performing belief you do not feel, choosing kindness not because you are required to, but because it reflects what you genuinely value. Those things do not contradict Confucian ideas. In many ways, they are the heart of them. And that, for me, is the part worth holding on to. Before I close, I want to ask you something. Have you ever found yourself drawn to a philosophy or belief system, not because someone told you to, but because something in it just clicked with how you already see the world? And have you also found parts of it that felt wrong or uncomfortable for you personally? How did you handle that tension? I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments, because this is the kind of conversation I genuinely find valuable, and you might say something that helps someone else figure out what they are feeling too. Thanks for watching. If this video resonated with you, please consider hitting the subscribe button. I am currently working toward my goal of 1,000 subscribers so I can finally monetize this channel and turn this passion into a sustainable part of my future. This is my unfiltered diary of solo living in the Philippines, and your support helps me keep this channel growing. If you would like to help out even more, you can check out the Buy a Treat for My Pets link in the description. My dogs definitely appreciate the love. Make sure you are subscribed so you do not miss the next update. Thank you for being such an important part of this journey. I will see you in the next one.